This episode was made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 163 of Ink to Film Podcast, where we read the book.
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Anne Rice's 1976 novel, Interview with the Vampire. So James, how is your French? Because I hope it's better than mine, because we got some French words to pronounce today.
Yeah, right. I mean, I took 2 years of French in high school and haven't flexed that muscle in like a decade, so...
Okay, well, I'm going to rely on you then, because that's 2 more years than I took. Some of these names, some of these situations, we have some French. So this is Interview with the Vampire, Anne Rice, which neither of us have ever read this novel prior to this, or any other Anne Rice novel, I assume.
Right.
And I've seen the movie, but you have not.
Correct.
So this is truly like your first introduction to this. This is, a landmark vampire novel, especially in like American genre fiction. So many people who created, Twilight. You look at Charlene Harris with the Sookie Stackhouse books. True Blood. So many of the vampire massive novels that came after this owe a lot to Anne Rice, I think, and in these books. And this, by the way, still publishing today. Seems like has gone through cycles in her life where she would publish books and then not publish. But I think there's some Vampire Chronicles books that have come out in the last 5 years. So still active and publishing. I wanted to start off, though, with sort of a spoiler-free reaction. And I know this book's, old now. It's 76, so it's been out for a long time. But like me and you, we're fresh to it. So I assume we might have some listeners who are curious about it, maybe have never read it, and want to know, like, is it worth dipping in and seeing what all the hype is about? I mean, hype. It's been an iconic book for years. So, is it something that's worth going back to and revisiting? Going back to the 70s. What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I found myself asking a lot of sort of like context questions when I was reading, like where this lies in sort of the pantheon of vampire stories, because I think it does. And it felt to me like I knew this was an important story, and I knew through like cultural osmosis like a lot of the things that went on, but I mean I found myself thinking about other things we've covered, like recently we covered the Old Guard, and the Old Guard deals with immortals, and
Sure.
what I think is interesting about dealing with immortals, and something that I was wondering if it was a popular thing at the time, is dealing with like the introspective look at what it means to be alive forever and see everyone around you die and be really lonely in the world, except for these people who are also immortals with you, who can understand you, and what those relationships are like. And what I found myself thinking is like, I wonder if this was the beginning of a trend, because I knew it was a massive novel for vampires, because you think of like Hollywood at the time, and you think of some of the classic Dracula stories and things like that, and he's more of a monster. Dracula's a monster, and I think he's there to like terrify people and terrify audiences, and he's kind of like, he definitely sets up a lot of the things that we see in this, with like sexuality and sensualness being associated with vampires. And I think this one was sort of hitting me in a way that I wasn't expecting, in the fact that it's really this idea of like what it means to live forever, how your philosophical outlook on life would change, and like anything from your mortal life, how that would be affected by your immortal life, and like how you would think of religion and relationships you had with people, and what would be important and what would sort of fall away and seem unimportant. And it's also interesting to think of it in the context of like our own lives. Like reading this book, it's like, if you did become immortal, what are the things that would become irrelevant to you, and like should you be worrying about those things on a day-to-day basis? I found myself kind of thinking about these things in my own life.
Yeah. I mean, immortality is a fascinating subject. I think it always will be to us mortals. And Anne Rice absolutely is doing the thing you're talking about. And I think I was reading, back doing research for the author and for the book, And I was seeing that was what she did differently. Not to say that no one was doing it, but the idea that she is the one who like did it and made it hugely popular. And that was writing from the perspective of the vampire, with the vampire as protagonist versus the vampire as the monster, like you were saying. And that sort of opens the door for so many other vampire stories we see where we're used to empathizing with the vampire and understanding their side of things, and like the sort of tortured existence of the vampire. That's like super common these days. But that was something that she really popularized with these novels. And you touched a little bit on the monster element too, because I wanted to give her credit in that her vampires are still pretty horrific at times. They do horrible things. They kill many, many people. They're basically serial killers because they're killing multiple humans per night, some of them. And the book doesn't shy away from like that really dark element of just how violent their existence is. So she does that, but then she also is able to make them sort of elegant and refined and have a sort of romance to them that I think a lot of people associate with vampires as well. So she's able to do both. It's not like one gets completely lost for the other. It's an interesting balance between those two elements.
Definitely. And I mean, I think that represents our main character, the
Louis.
The Louis, like whether the questions being asked, like, can you be a vampire and hold on to your humanity and hold on to the things that made you human? And that's honestly why I found Louis to be a fascinating character.
Let's set up a little bit of the just the setup of the novel. Is that there is a boy, he's just referred to as the boy throughout the book, who is interviewing a vampire who is Louis, who is telling him the story of his life, which is a 200-year saga involving lots of stuff, which we'll get into when we get into spoilers. But that's the setup, is the sort of framing device for the novel, is an interviewer sitting down in a room with a vampire, and the vampire's going to tell him his life story. Also, it's the interviewer at the beginning seems like he kind of is on board with the vampire stuff, but is maybe thinking it's all a ruse, and then is quickly sort of bought in on it. How did that framing device work for you, and was it the kind of thing you were expecting from this book?
This made me respect the choice to do an interview. Going in, I wasn't thinking I was going to appreciate the interview framing device, but what it allows you to do is, rather than sort of getting introspective from a first person view, you are still getting that, but the vampire's interpreting, it's not like omnipotent sort of narrating. The vampire is telling you how he felt in certain situations throughout his life.
It's his story in his words, right?
Exactly. And so he's able to sort of like have perspective on things that he did early on as a vampire and things like that. So I appreciated it for the fact that it's not just done for the novelty of it. It's done, and it allows you to like understand the character a little bit more, because you can see what's actually happening and then hear how Louis is describing it and sort of get a gauge of where he's at currently during the interview. Kind of looking at everything in hindsight.
I thought it was really cool, personally. Like, I was on board with it. I thought that it was immediately engaging, and it felt fresh to me, even though, I know this is an older novel, but it was a fresh frame for a vampire story, right? Like, it's, like you said, it's not some sort of omniscient viewpoint. It's this interview situation, and it was cool, and I don't know. I like that the boy is able to also be a bit of a audience stand-in, asking questions that might be, raised in the reader's mind, reacting to things as the reader might. But then we also get that fun, like we can kind of get the perspective of being somewhere removed from the situation too, because like we maybe know more about vampires than the interviewer does.
There's also the fun play of like vampire tropes, which ones exist in this universe, and like the interviewer asking them as we probably would be asking with our knowledge of vampires.
Yeah, it's like, okay, so garlic, crosses, what, can you turn into mist? Like, what's going on here? Yeah, it was fun. I mean, and it's also cool because you get, like, I assume this is supposed to be somewhat contemporary for when the book came out, so probably in the 70s, is when this interview is supposed to be taking place. Yet the book itself is really mostly in the past, like way past. So you get that sort of lens of time stuff where you can look back at something 200 years ago and comment on it from the perspective of someone who is alive today.
Right.
Which is, I don't know, it's a cool novelty of, like, this immortal character who was alive when the events, in the 1700s, 1800s are taking place, and then also is alive now to comment on it and compare, which is cool.
Right. Yeah. I mean, things like, you think about the time periods that they're talking about, and it's like early America, the Civil War, like all these things that could have been involved in the story and were technically going on. You think like, I think the 1800s, they're in Louisiana. And so it's like, you would think where, are Civil War things going on in the background of the story also. I just like anytime that you go into like American history, some things that, we learned a lot about growing up, you can kind of add that into add that as just layers that aren't even touched on into the story.
Yeah, so they're not really touched on, but you're right. I guess there could be stuff like that going on. It seems like they weren't very interested in like the politics of America. They were very sort of focused on their lives. And when I say their lives, I'm talking about Lestat, which is a very famous vampire from the series, perhaps the most famous vampire from the series. Yet is actually not the main character of this book, which I thought was interesting too. Like it's a little different. Like I feel like in the movie, both vampires are obviously front and center, but the book really felt much more tied to Louis because it's his story. He's telling it. So I don't know. In that way, I was surprised that Lestat wasn't a more prominent figure, even though he was, probably the second most prominent figure in the book.
Yeah, I think that probably has to do with cast partly, like the cast of the movie. Like you're like I'm going to use both of these actors to their full capacity, and I haven't even seen the movie, but because I've seen clips and I've seen pictures and all this other stuff, I kept imagining them as Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise the whole way through. Like I don't know why, just their face, young Brad Pitt and young Tom Cruise.
Yeah. I'm excited to get to the film, which we'll get into next week. But I was kind of glad that I didn't remember a ton of it, actually, because I was able to really dive into this novel as far as like the plot that happens. But before I do want to get into some stuff about Anne Rice. I think it's actually really interesting. But before we do, I want to touch on one last thing, as in the spoiler-free talk. What did you think of her prose? Because Anne Rice is sort of famous for having a certain style to her writing. And to me, it seems like the kind of thing that you're going to have an opinion about one way or another. So how did you feel about her actual writing style?
I mean, I enjoyed it. I didn't think that there was anything off-putting about it. I feel like that's what you're leading to, right? Like some people don't enjoy it. To me, it felt like fitting for a vampire novel. It felt like part romance, part in interesting ways, and then like there are horror aspects and elements as well. But the way that she actually writes, I found to be like sort of, I don't know. I think she was attempting to write in sort of a timeless way, something that would like fit along with the characters. Yeah.
So Louis is 200-year-old vampire, and he talks and he speaks in sort of a kind of old-timey way at times. The pace of the novel is fairly slow. There's a lot of detail, and there's a lot of sort of philosophical musings that go on throughout, and because of that, it has sort of a gothic feel throughout, and all of that, I think, creates a prose that is almost more akin to something literary than what maybe other modern sort of vampire novelists are doing. Although I'm sure there are a bunch of people who tried to sort of crib this style. I'm going to read the opening paragraph, just because it will give the listener a taste. "I see," said the vampire thoughtfully, and slowly he walked across the room towards the window. For a long time he stood there against the dim light from Divisorato Street and the passing beams of traffic. The boy could see the furnishings of the room more clearly now. The round oak table, the chairs. A wash basin hung on one wall with a mirror. He set his briefcase on the table and waited. So yeah, like even that opening paragraph, you can see it's taking its time, right? Like there's a lot of waiting. There's looking out the window and seeing beams of light. People are moving slowly. And I think it really fits with this character who is an immortal and has been around for 200 years and is not in a hurry. And wants to tell his story in his own time. And because of that, if you maybe are more used to a faster paced style book, it could maybe feel slow to you. So I think that's the thing. Like, if you're okay with that kind of prose, you're gonna love this. And I think for me, I don't know. I guess I can enjoy different kinds of prose. And
Right.
I was able to. For me, this became a feature of the book. Because I can appreciate this style of writing when done well, and I think it is done well here. There's an appeal to that. There's an eye for detail. There's a richness of the world that I like, and I'm okay with it taking a little longer. And the overloading of details can be off-putting for some, but for me, I don't know, it just helped flesh out the world in a way that I enjoyed, and it actually became kind of a feature of the book. Even though, like, I've read the first Sookie Stackhouse novel, and like I can tell you that Charlene Harris writes a very different style than this. So if you read a bunch of other vampire novels, maybe this is very different to you.
Yeah, so many things to comment on here. So I think it's about, for me, when there's a slow burn novel or movie or whatever it is, I feel like there's a certain level. First of all, you need to be in the mood for it, but there's a certain level of immersion that you can get that I really enjoy. I like being, like, I like those moments of like in a film, it's introspection, right? It's like looking out a window, looking at a beam of light, and in a book like this, it makes it feel very cinematic to me. It makes it feel very slow burn, taking its time deliberately. And then I want to compare this to Tom Clancy's novel that we just read, The Hunt for Red October, which was also slow paced, but in a different way. It was slow paced in a way that it was very technical and it was describing things to you that were like concrete in the real world. And it's not as interpretive. It's a lot of like, telling you. Right. Yeah. And so I think that's where the difference comes. As much as both of them were sort of slow burns in their own way, it's very different when you have like something to chew on versus like just information being given to you, I think. And that's like sort of, that's why I enjoyed the slow burn of this story as well. And it, like you said, it really fits in with this sort of 200-year-old vampire who's, and the gothic, like I found myself being like, this is totally like the vampire stories that people would really latch onto and say like, look at the struggle and the strife that like you can compare to your own life, and like I just felt it to be very like, I kept thinking like, this is so like, this is the blueprint for eventually what emo like goth and emo would be sort of based on, in my opinion. Like I remember like going through an emo phase and being like, I would have responded super well to this at that time.
So before I get into Anne Rice, the person, let's first thank Jamie D for commissioning this project. She has been a patron for a long time, and she is a part of our Jukebox Hero tier, where she is able to unlock projects. Now, that is actually a tier that we're going to be retiring next year. We're going to be putting more focus on patron-led polls, I think. So there is still going to be an opportunity to sort of do communal commissioning, but we want to thank her for her support all this time, and for hopefully she enjoys this coverage of these Anne Rice novels.
Yeah, I mean, these last two projects that we've done actually were both patron commissioned, and who's to say if we would have covered them without their commissioning it. So we do really appreciate it, and like, both of them have been a lot of fun, and I'm really enjoying this one so far, especially because like it's something I should have read or seen up to this point, and now I'm getting to.
Yeah, Tom Clancy and Anne Rice, I mean, massive names, so, I'm glad that we're touching on them. So let's talk a little bit about Anne Rice, the person. So she was born in 1941. She is an American author of Gothic fiction, Christian literature, and erotic literature. Best known for her Vampire Chronicles books, which revolve around the central character of Lestat. She is one of the elite members of the 100 million copies sold club. And we've talked about a few of them on this podcast, right? Like other authors in this club. And, hugely successful, has made a massive empire. And when you're in that stratospheric level of sort of author stardom, you are affecting culture, right? Like your work has had a massive reach. And I wanted to touch a little bit on what you were saying before. Her books are known for appealing to the LGBTQ plus community, and also I think sort of the emo and all that stuff, right? Which some of them there's some overlap there, And it was because these characters are sort of outsiders, are viewed as outsiders in society. And a lot of people read into this book as it being sort of an ongoing allegory about a gay romance between Lestat and Louis. And there's just a lot there, I think, for people. And as we go, we can talk about her relationship to that, to her fandom, is kind of interesting too, because she has said that that's not actually what she intended.
Oh, wow.
But she actually is okay with it. But that wasn't her intention going in. So I don't know. I just thought that was interesting. But she was born in New Orleans and was raised in a Catholic family, but initially became an agnostic as a young adult. She was married and had a child, importantly, who was diagnosed with terminal cancer at 4 years old.
Wow.
And passed away. And she wrote this book shortly following that. And the character of Claudia is a direct, reference or allegory for a lot of her feelings she was having about her daughter who died from cancer. So she went to trauma and heartache and just like the worst tragedy you can go through, a young child, and captured it here in this book. And I think knowing that actually really influences the way I look at the book too, especially the character of Claudia, because I feel like if you don't know that, kind of a troubling character in many ways, and it's still so, but it helps a little bit, I think, for me to realize that is what the author was working through.
Yeah, and it's not like it's not its own character. It isn't her daughter, right? It's like
right.
It's the inspiration of the character, and then she runs with it and does a lot of other stuff. But yeah, I didn't know that, so that's really tragic to hear. That's absolutely brutal.
So she would go on to that would launch her career, right? Like after that, and would go on to sell many books. Her husband, the only person she was ever married to, actually died in 2002 from a brain cancer. So this is a person who's been through a lot of tragedy in her life. She has had a journey with her faith. I'm not going to pretend to understand all of it, but she was early on an agnostic, and then she found Christianity later in her life, and actually wrote a couple of what are considered Christian novels, and then has since come out and said that she is no longer a Christian, or no longer a believer in organized Christianity, and has sort of found. She says that Christ is still important to her, but she doesn't believe in any of the sort of organized aspects of religion, and doesn't follow any particular sect or whatever of religion. And it appears to have some sort of spirituality, but distance herself. And it seemed like a lot of what she didn't like was a lot of the sort of political stuff going on with the church and social issues and things like that. She really couldn't get on board with where the church was going. And I don't know. I do know some Christians who are like that, whether or not they'd say that they're not, consider themselves Christians or not, versus I don't really subscribe to any one organized religion or what have you. I do know a lot of people like that. So I just thought it was interesting that this is someone who clearly, and then most recent interview, she actually said she's a secular humanist, which I tend to feel like I am myself as well. So I don't know. It's so interesting to see that this is somebody who has struggled a lot with these kind of questions, these existential questions. And I think you see that reflected in these characters in this book.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to think, like you said, this was early on in her career, and then she would find Christianity later and then go back and forth. But it seems like this has clearly always been the case. Like, if you look at the character of Louis, there's a lot of struggling with faith and what it means and if God is real and all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there was a couple of parts in there that I was, co-signing sort of Louis' take on, what does it mean if there's no God and if we're all that's important, then we're what makes sense of the world. And I don't know, there's a lot of good stuff in there of him. It's a lot of philosophy type stuff, which I can see turning some people off, but I don't know. I liked it because it lined up more with how I feel.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, being someone who did go to church and was, raised in a religious household, and then not identifying with any of that anymore, I definitely like sort of understood Louis' sort of struggle with it and everything. And it's tough when you're raised in it and you're a kid to like rewire your brain after you've been in something that, I mean, I would consider to be basically like, it's so overwhelming when you're a child. It seems so large and looming in your life, and then moving away from it, it's very interesting to see like Louis struggle with that.
Yeah. So a little bit more about Anne Rice. She was actually born Howard Allen Francis O'Brien. Born with the first name Howard, which apparently was a thing throughout her whole life. Like when she first went to like school, she was like, "Call me Anne," because it was just a name she liked. It wasn't until later that she was able to legally change her name to Anne. Her mother, and this is another bit of tragedy that I didn't mention earlier. Her mother died when she was 15 years old from alcoholism. Wow. And apparently I saw an interview, she said she was sort of a bohemian figure who had a lot of problems, but was also very influential in her life early on. And after that, she ended up going to this this school called St. Joseph's Academy. And she says, quote, "It was something like out of Jane Eyre, a dilapidated, awful, medieval type of place. I really hated it and wanted to leave. I felt betrayed by my father," because her father sent her there, her and her sisters. And later, her father would remarry, and they were able to move out. But it sounds like, I mean, that was really a struggle for her. She went, I assume this is the kind of place you like lived at.
Yeah.
Kind of place. So tough stuff early on in life. She did have another child. She has a son, Christopher Rice, who actually is a best-selling author in his own right.
Wow. Very interesting. It's always fascinating to me when you see someone like Anne Rice, someone whose the shadow would loom so large, and then their kid is able to sort of carve their own path in that way. You see it with like film directors and stuff all the time. It's really wild. Because it would seem so intimidating to try to like be in that.
It's like either you go that way or you go. I mean, look at Stephen King's, children. Right. It's like either you try and follow in their footsteps, or you completely go another path. I think it's like the only ways you can really go. So I did want to touch on one other thing. In mid 1979, after they had Christopher, her and her son were admitted alcoholics. And they both quit drinking because they didn't want to give him a life similar to the one that she had growing up. So I just wanted to give her sort of, I admire that sort of conviction, especially if that you're struggling with something, to sort of clean it up and say, I don't want to do that.
It's
I don't know,
tough, man. I also felt like, that brings up something interesting, because I was thinking about the nature of vampires, and we'll get more into this, but there is a certain addiction quality to a vampire as well, right? With the addiction to blood and some of that stuff. So I don't know, again, maybe something that she would struggle with. I'm not sure. What year did you say that she was basically
79. So what happened was, after her daughter died, she went really hard into alcoholism, and also developed like depression, obviously, and then developed OCD. She talked about how she was really struggling with it for a while, like obsessive cleaning of the hands, things like that. So struggled with a lot of mental illness, and had to go through a lot of therapy. That's what I was reading, but was able to come out on the other side of it, and was able to produce this novel that went on to become, so influential. So another interesting thing to note, that she signed with an agent at a writers' conference, and they would try and sell her book, and it was rejected 5 times from major publishers, and then finally sold for $12,000 advance, which was pretty good for the time, but not groundbreaking, obviously. And then I just think it's interesting that this is the kind of book and the kind of career that would go on to make that agent's career. You know what I mean? Like that agent,
right,
was set for life, essentially, from being Anne Rice's agent. So that's the kind of like gem that these agents are searching for, and was able to find here. And someone who had to face rejection early on in her career.
Everybody, I feel like, has something that they have to overcome in these situations, and some people, personally and like as themselves, and then also within the industries. It sounds like
she had a lot of both of those.
Everybody has rejections, is what I've heard, but some people get lucky and just take off right away. But it's you know, if you have a bunch of rejections, I feel like it's also once something does click, anything can happen. You know, like once one thing falls into place, like something like somebody taking a shot on Anne Rice turns into this like monumental career, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the game that you know, so many people are playing in this industry. I think everybody hopes for, and it's like when, you know, wanting to be a writer, you know, I think it's always better to aim for mid-list. You know, like
Right.
you can have dreams of being this, you know, runaway bestseller, but like it's so rare. Like aim for mid-list, and then you hope that something you write hits. And you know, that's kind of, I think, a safe place to set your aspirations. And obviously even that's kind of lofty, but it's more attainable. And I think a lot of agents and publishers and stuff out there are also similarly looking for, like, I want to have some success with what I'm doing. I want to sell some copies. I want to make some money. They're not out there going like, if I don't find the next Stephen King, if I don't find the next Anne Rice, J.K. Rowling, then I don't know why I'm in this business. No, like those are lottery ticket style things. It just don't happen to everybody.
Yeah.
Anyway, I know we're running long, and I do want to get into the plot, but before I do, there's also something that I had been hearing about Anne Rice in writer circles, and that was that she really doesn't like fan fiction, and was famously, like, she sued one of the major websites, early websites in the internet, and fan fiction for her books was huge, as you can imagine. There was a lot of slash fic, there's a lot of erotic fiction written about these characters. And she, 20 years ago, was a very vocal opponent of it. Now, I have seen that in recent years, she has softened on it and says now that she while she still thinks that writers should be writing original stuff, she does see that there's a certain transitory period that you could be in where fan fiction could be useful to you as a writer. Now, I'm not saying I think that, but that's what Anne Rice says. So I don't know. I was happy to see that she sort of has softened on that a little bit, because I know a lot of people really love writing fan fiction. It's not something I've ever really done, but I know lots of writers who find it to be a really nice avenue for their writing in a sort of low pressure way to do it. And I know there are even really successful authors who still write fan fiction occasionally under pen names. So I don't know. It just a lot of writers out there have opinions about Anne Rice, and some of them might be stemming from this, because I think she generated a lot of anger in the community when she came out so, vehemently against fan fiction.
Yeah, I think I think people used to be, and this is going to be a blanket statement, so prepare for me to be wrong multiple times.
Ready.
But
here he goes.
This back in that time, I feel like people were very precious with their work. In a way that they felt like no one can write it besides me. No one understands the characters besides me, potentially. And this idea of people going around writing with their own characters, I don't know what it was, but they wanted to keep them close to the chest. And then it seems like as time has gone on, people have understood that, like, well, people being this passionate about your work and wanting to write fan fiction on it is an extension of how much they love it. And it's going to continue the popularity of your core, novels that you're writing. And it seems like a lot of people would be like over the moon to have fan fiction written about their work at this point.
I agree, and I think it is, it was early on in the era of fan fiction, at least on the internet, and it was a lot of unknowns around it. Like, what if this becomes more popular than my books? Like, I feel like there was a lot of anxiety about it, and maybe that was caught up a little bit in that attitude. But I'm sure there were authors who were early on adopters of it and were fine with it. So, again, probably shouldn't make blanket statements, but I think there is some validity there. So let's get into the actual plot of the novel. We've dillied on long enough. Okay, so I have 3 chunks of plot I'm going to read, and then we can talk about each one. So, a vampire named Louis de Pointe, don't know if I'm doing that any justice, tells his life story to a reporter referred to simply as the Boy. In 1791, Louis is a young plantation owner living in Louisiana. Distraught by the death of his pious brother, he seeks death in any way possible. Louis is approached by a vampire named Lestat de Liancourt, who desires Louis' company. Lestat turns Louis into a vampire, and the two become immortal companions. Lestat spends time feeding off slaves, while Louis, who finds it morally repugnant to murder humans to survive, feeds on animals. Louis and Lestat are forced to leave when Louis' slaves instigate an uprising. Louis sets his own plantation aflame. He and Lestat kill the slaves to keep word from spreading about vampires living in Louisiana. Gradually, Louis bends under Lestat's influence and begins feeding from humans. Escaping to New Orleans, Louis feeds off a 5-year-old girl whom he finds next to the corpse of her mother. Louis begins to think of leaving Lestat and going his own way. Lestat then turns the girl into a vampire, a daughter named Claudia, for them, to give Louis a reason to stay. Claudia takes to killing easily, but she begins to realize over time that she can never grow up. Her mind matures into that of an intelligent, assertive woman, but her body remains that of a young girl. Okay, so that's the introduction of like the 3 main characters and the events of the novel. What did you think?
So, I mean, I can't even, there's so much to talk about, so many layers to dig into here.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I would start with the relationship between all 3 characters. So clearly there's a love that can only be understood if you are an immortal vampire between Lestat and Louis. And I think it's unhealthy. Obviously, it seems like there's like a master, almost like not servant, but master sort of subservient person role here. And
there's like a dominant and submissive person in the
right,
in the
exactly.
relationship, it seems
and
like.
then there's also like, I think it brings into question like the idea of relationships, like power dynamics in relationships. And then also, I don't know that you could say that it's not sexual, but there is like a love that's like kind of not sexual. It's like, as far as we see, it's just like a love that's like,
so that's really,
it's hard to describe.
That's one of the really interesting bits that I was surprised that she was able to maintain sort of plausible deniability the whole time. Like, are these vampires fucking? I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
It's never really said. That I could find, right? Like, unless I missed it, it was they would mention like being lovers, but it was like, are they mentioning like being lovers in that way, or are they being lovers in that they loved each other? Right. I don't know.
And they also, like, when he talked about actually becoming a vampire and him sucking his blood and then like sucking the vampire's blood and how sexual that felt and like very
super
like
sexual.
erotic.
Yeah, it was like on the nose, like this is almost a sex act. And I think throughout, that was kind of the implication I was getting, is that sex for vampires has been replaced by the sort of the sucking of the blood and the intimacy there. And that moment where Lestat makes Louis into a vampire is extremely sexual, even though they're not having sex, obviously, but they are exchanging fluids and feeling each other's hearts beat and having this really intimate connection. And similarly, with Claudia, which brings all sorts of troubling things into play, there a lot of this same stuff goes down.
And I mean, that brings in the question of like vampires. And so it's like, there's clear, these people that they go and feed on, they're just raping them then, basically, right? Because
for sure. I mean, it's against their will almost always, right? There's no consent there. And that, I mean, that definitely brings up this troubling power dynamic throughout the entire book. But like, I think it's on purpose, is my reading of it, at least, is like, that's what's evil about these creatures, right? Like they become so aloof and sort of removed from humanity that they start to view humans as just food. Now, Louis is sort of an exception to that, and he struggles with it throughout. So he's kind of he gives you a nice inroad as a human. Reading the book, you're like, okay, at least he feels bad. But like so many of the other vampires don't seem to feel bad at all, and we see them just horrifically killing just tons and tons of people. And it's because they don't view them like they almost. And I was thinking of it as almost like you might look at a insect and say, oh, he only lives a week anyway, and so what does it matter compared to my life, right? Like, and that's how it feels like these vampires view humans. It's like, oh, they live such brief lives anyway. It's almost better if I just end it now. It'll save them later suffering, right? Like, there's so many ways that they excuse their behavior throughout, and a lot of it is very monstrous, and it's told in a way that is like, Louis slightly condemns it, but I think we, the reader, are supposed to realize that it's way worse than he's really even saying it is.
Yeah. I mean, we're so close to these characters because we're getting his point of view and like hearing his story. But yeah, the grayness of Louis continues to be probably the most interesting thing in the story to me, because he talks about how he didn't understand humanity until he became a vampire. Like, he didn't understand the beauty of humanity. He didn't understand like how intense art was, and what life meant and all these things, until he became a vampire, which is such a double-edged sword, because then he's also like forced and like drawn to feed on humanity, and then he feels bad about it. And there's this whole idea of like, can he keep his human, like I said before, can he keep his humanity while being this monster? And that's like what's explored in the story, I would say, mostly.
Yeah. Well, and him being a slave owner actually kind of works well for this attitude, because he's, convinced of other people being lesser. And there's a moment where he sort of says like, in my youth, I viewed the slaves a certain way, but I really felt like it wasn't engaged with as much as it could have been, and probably should have been. Right. There was also some language in there that I took a little bit of umbrage with, where it was sort of given as a statement of fact that the slaves were more connected to the supernatural and therefore more believing, and that's why they were able to see them as vampires.
Right. Specifically because they were like, this was a tough part to read, but specifically because they were freshly from Africa. They were Africans that hadn't been Americanized yet. So they were very connected to this like spiritual, like it was very troubling.
And like,
sure.
I can see where you would go, like how that could come about as you're thinking about it. But like, it is also racist, right? Like, it just is,
no,
it's like, it's the problem that we've seen in so much other fiction, where Black people are considered magical, right? And considered closer to the supernatural, and it's othering. It's saying that they are somehow different than us white people. And yeah, I don't know. Book written in the 70s, and it's talking about slaves. I thought it was handled okay. That's about as good as I can give it. And that's me, a white dude, reading it. So take that with a huge grain of salt.
Definitely. The story, they like you said, they don't even really engage with it. It's just like, this is the thing that was going on at the time. So it's talked about.
I would have liked to see some more contrition from Louis about being a slave owner, but honestly, it felt like it was kind of beside the point.
Yeah, it wasn't even about that, really.
That doesn't even hold a candle to all the people I killed, so let's talk about that. It is tough, like, when you think about how monstrous these characters are, like, the idea of liking them is kind of troubling. But I don't know. You're also like, it's like people who find reading about serial killers interesting, listening to podcasts about serial killers. Like even these figures that do horrific things. There's interest there, and I feel like it tells us something about the darker impulses of ourselves, and seeing the sort of evil that humanity is capable of. I don't know. There is something there of interest for people, and like, I think there's a reason that dark fiction like this does well, and why people will continue to be drawn to characters like this, even when if we talk about them, it sounds like it's like, why would you want to read about this character? He sounds absolutely horrible,
right? And
he mostly is, but he feels kind of bad about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's the main thing I think I was gonna get at is with Louis, you can at least see that he has doubts about it. He's struggling with it. These all of these things, at least not in the slavery, in the like killing people and sucking their blood and all that other stuff. He has problems with it, and that's sort of why people can still go along with what he's doing and sort of like the character still. Because I think you can walk away from the story having been like, I like this character. Look how tortured he is. Maybe some of it is self-inflicted. But he's still engaging with it. Whereas someone like Lestat is a character that doesn't, from a perspective that we get from Louis' perspective, seems like sort of just a monster wanting to do everything that life can, all the pleasures of life for himself without a second thought.
It seemed to me like there is a lot more to tell about Lestat, so I can see why this character would go on to be really central, because I didn't quite understand why he was the way he was. And
exactly.
I think, a lot of his backstory is completely mysterious. Mm-hmm. He seems much less of those sort of like, I don't know, the kind of vampire that Louis is, right? Like it seems to care a lot less about the people he kills. He's a lot more monstrous in many ways, and Louis was very frustrated with him, and especially recounting this story to the boy, right? Like, I wish early on I had done things differently. He could have done things differently. He didn't have to do it this way. Though he had a lot of criticisms about him as like his sire as a vampire, right? And how he handled a lot of it. And in many ways, Lestat deeply flawed, right? Like, not sort of completely in control of his own emotion and his own desires, like in many ways way more out of control than Louis was.
Yeah, I do have a comparison to make that I think will kind of spoil the end. So if, like, I would say, like, skip ahead a few minutes if you don't want to hear that, but I do need to say it here. So basically, like, the comparison is, I think that Lestat and Louis represent two sides of the vampire coin, right? So Louis represents he's someone who is no longer human and, like, still yearns for humanity. And I think that Lestat is we can still see flashes of humanity even though he doesn't want to believe it. And I think that we see it, like, with his father and all of that. But when his father's dying, he's like he like shows some humanity still. And what we see is the progression for Louis throughout the story to become more like Lestat. So, like you said, there might be some story for Lestat where he's still connected to humanity, but then loses everything and loses his humanity, becomes who we see in this novel, who Louis becomes near the end of this novel, where he doesn't even want to engage with the fact that he thinks that he's completely disconnected from humanity, but he's still, in the back of our minds, we know, like, well, he's doing this interview. He's, like, why would he be doing the interview? Like, all of these reasons to still be connected to humanity as much as we feel like he's lost it. So, like, they kind of represent two different stages in, like, the vampire life cycle, maybe.
Yeah. No, I can see that. And I think we got to bring in Claudia to this discussion a little bit, too, because she's the other really central character to this book. And a tragic story, Louis, in one of his weaker moments, feeds on her, and then Lestat, after, like, it's one of the more, like, memorable scenes early on in the book where he's having this, like, he has multiple women over, and he's talking to Louis, and he's killing them. I think they're prostitutes, and he's being, like, overtly cruel and, like, terrifying the woman he's killing, and it's, like, upsetting Louis, and it really is demonstrating the difference between them. And then, but also, like, that was one of the scarier moments for me, as far as, like, finding finding Lestat scary, was because of the way he was so casually inflicting cruelty and terror onto people. And it really showed the way he considers humans to be essentially just food for him. And more than that, though, because he, like, delighted in frightening them. Like, yeah, I don't know, there was something really dark there. And then he makes Claudia into a vampire in an act that is clearly really fucked up. Like, when it happens, like, like, this is bad news.
Right.
And I really like the way it was explored, in that she, of course, that she's going to grow up and sort of have a adult's mind in this 5-year-old's body. So she's 5 in the book, which I think is significantly younger than she is in the movie, if I remember correctly. I feel like there's a lot of stuff that I kind of knew where they were going to go with that, and they do. But then there's a lot that was a, like, really interesting place I wasn't thinking about, and that was the idea that when she became a vampire, she did not have this prior life to draw on. So in some ways, she was a lot more sort of feral vampire who didn't have memories of humanity. And because of that, was, I don't know, just like, there was a certain immaturity to her even as she got older, and the immaturity came from her lack of a human life versus her lack of years on the planet. So there's a really interesting dichotomy there.
Yeah, it's almost like if you took a child and then they were, like, raised by wolves in the woods or something. You know what I mean? Like, how your feral nature would become sort of the only nature and because
she's killing people every night from that point on. Like, Lestat's taking her out to feed on people.
And not to mention, like,
before she even knows what it means to be dead, right? She has no concept.
The other thing is the two people who are raising her, like we've talked about, are sort of two different kinds of vampires.
Yeah.
So she's all that's her only influence at this point. And yeah, it's super troubling and like a bold move to do in the story. I don't think that I would have been brave enough to do because of all of the
I think this
things.
is honestly one of the reasons that you might have seen some of these publishers turn this book down, because this feels like really dicey, really tricky territory, right? And you can see a lot of people getting really angry about it or really bouncing off of it because of it.
There's also like relationship, love, almost sexual again, like nature going on with a child.
It's hinted at that maybe it is. I don't know.
It's very, like I said, troubling. It seems like they created a child, and then it's also troubling because she grows, 65 years pass, and she's 65 in a child's body, and all of the pleasures of life, and like the idea of growing and becoming a woman. She is a woman in her mind, but like they've taken away what she's had taken away from her is the ability to ever sort of grow and become a
have an
fully
adult
realized
body.
body.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
Very crazy stuff.
it's it's tragic, and she really lives a tragic life. And again, this is one where reading about the inspiration for this character and what happened to Anne Rice's daughter actually really helped me understand what she was trying to do with this. With Claudia,
because I didn't know that, and I felt like it was like pedophile stuff going on. I felt like that to me.
It
like
feels that
felt
way
like
at times,
teetering on it sometimes.
But and I think she is playing with that in some way. It really feels like, there's some fiction and some stories like to dance along an edge of making us uncomfortable, challenging us in ways, and I think this book is doing that, right? Like it is at the edge of like what is considered completely taboo, like don't talk about subjects.
Well, it's bringing in this idea of like, can we as mortals understand love and sexuality in immortals and stuff? And like that's the world that she wants you to engage with. It's just like you said, like I can see why publishers would have pushed back against it. Maybe some. Yeah.
Anyway, and I don't know the answer to these questions. I'm just saying that's in the book, and you're going to struggle with it when you read it. If you do read this book, like it's going to come up, and it's going to be something. So, if you really don't want to engage with that, I completely get it. Be aware that is in there. Okay, let's move into the next chunk of the novel, and we can talk more about these characters. Claudia blames Lestat for her condition, and after 60 years of living with him, hatches a plot to kill Lestat by poisoning him and cutting his throat. Claudia and Louis then dump his body into a nearby swamp. As Louis and Claudia prepare to flee to Europe, Lestat appears, having recovered from Claudia's attack, and attacks them in return. Louis sets fire to their home and barely escapes with Claudia, leaving a furious Lestat to be consumed by the flames. Arriving in Europe, Louis and Claudia seek out more of their kind. They do indeed encounter vampires, but these vampires appear to be nothing more than mindless animated corpses. It is only when they reach Paris that they encounter vampires like themselves, specifically the 400-year-old vampire Armand and his coven. Inhabiting an ancient theater, Armand and his vampire coven disguise themselves as humans and feed on live, terrified humans and mock plays before a live human audience. Claudia is repulsed by these vampires and what she considers to be their cheap theatrics, but Louis and Armand are drawn to each other. Okay, so that's the next big chunk. Let's back up a little bit to the confrontation between Claudia and Lestat, where she tries to kill him.
Yeah, we should definitely set up the reason why they dislike Lestat is that he's sort of the all instincts vampire, like I've been talking about. Like he represents like there's not like Louis doesn't respond well to the fact that he's like not showing class with the way he's doing things. He's not refined in the ways that we've talked about as a vampire could be. And that's sort of what Louis' expectation of a vampire was when he became a vampire. And then Claudia just doesn't really like his style of vampiring either. So eventually it comes to a head when it's like clear that he has power over them and doesn't
also it seems like they both believe that he is deliberately withholding information about what it means to be a vampire from them. And Claudia really wants to know and wants to like go find other vampires and find out more about what it means to be a vampire. And Lestat is not interested in that at all. And he kind of tells them like, you don't need to know. And they both get frustrated with that.
Louis doesn't necessarily want to do this until she brings it about. Claudia is the reason for this happening. I think without Claudia, I mean, although Louis wanted to leave before Claudia, but once Claudia came into the picture, there was no sort of idea of doing this until Claudia was like, I want to go figure out what's going on. Because once she found out how she came about, she wanted to know more and more and more, as you've said, and Lestat was withholding everything.
Well, and Louis feels incredibly guilty about Claudia's situation. And it feels like he is sort of willing to do almost anything to try and make it up to her. And if that's, kill Lestat, he ends up being on board with it. He doesn't like ever really agree with it, and he drags his feet a ton, but he also doesn't prevent it from happening.
It's funny because like he addresses it near the end of the novel, how he feels like he lived too passively. Like he feels like he in all these situations could have been taken more of an active role and like taken hold of his life and done different things, or his afterlife, his vampire life. And a lot of these things cascade that lead to events that he eventually regrets. So it's like these moments where he's like dragging his feet and not doing anything. He could have taken a more active role in not killing Lestat, or killing him more so that they knew he was dead, that kind,
so that he actually died, because he doesn't die.
Right,
like, he doesn't die here. He comes back. He has survived being thrown in the river and having his throat slit or whatever, because that doesn't kill a vampire. And then another confrontation goes down, and they end up burning down the plantation, and seemingly Lestat is dead again, although we learn later he is not here, but he suffers significant injury, it seems like. Right. And then we get the trip to Europe, which I actually thought was really interesting. And I don't remember this part in the movie. I assume something like this does happen, but I'll be curious to see if it's just something I've like wiped from my mind. But going around to these like small towns and the sort of monsters in the night, and going to this like monastery and encountering this revenant vampire. Right. I don't know. I thought this was like really interesting, like gothic horror. I don't know, like I kept expecting them to run into Van Helsing or something.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's what Rice is going for here. She wanted to engage with the known vampires, the monster vampires that were just like in the countryside terrorizing villages and all that sort of thing. And especially when they're like mindless and have no goals or anything like that. That's like what I think she was engaging with her vampires, who were the introspective, wanting to know their nature, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And there is sort of an explanation given of like, these are people who are made into vampires and then buried, and then spend an unknown amount of time just like being driven mad by their hunger, and also like decaying in the ground and stuff. And I guess that's how they end up becoming this more revenant figure who is more mindless. Although it's not like clearly explained, that's just a theory that's proposed by, I think, Claudia at one point.
Oh, so Armand. Let's talk about Armand.
And then they go to Paris.
Yeah, and then they find the kind of vampires they're looking for, this like sort of ancient vampire. And then this brings up interesting, we were talking about the religious aspects before. This brings up a lot of religion, with like Louis finally coming to grips with the fact that like in this world, this vampire has seen no evidence of like God or Satan or anything like that. So it kind of shatters Louis's world, even though he didn't really believe it. He sort of had an attachment to it still. Yeah.
There's this really interesting scene between them, where he first meets Armand, and he's immediately sort of like drawn to this person, and it seems like he has Armand has sort of a mesmerizing power over people, and he's able to use that on Claudia too. But they have this really strong connection, and I kept expecting it to be more nefarious than it was, but it actually seems to be pretty genuine. That they are sort of drawn to each other, and then you had this coven, you had this theater. Santiago, who like mimics Louis when he finds him in the like alleyway, and in this funny way where he's like mirroring him completely, and I don't know, this sort of vampire coven and their interactions with each other and putting on the theatrics. This is a lot more of like what I think I assumed an Anne Rice novel was going to be like. I don't know, for whatever reason, like this was what I was expecting. And it is present, but it's a smaller part of the novel than I was expecting it to be.
Yeah, the other thing that's interesting about this theater is that it's like an all human audience, and you have like these performances, and the audience loves it. and they're not really realizing that they're actually witnessing people like being fed on, but it shows that like I think there's a commentary being made on like humans loving violence even if they're not understanding it fully, as monstrous as like these vampires have been shown to be, the humans, even though it's fake to them, love it. You know, like they love it in the same way that like some of these like older vampires who love killing these people love it. I don't know, just really interesting because Armand represents like this basically the oldest vampire, and he is interested in Louis because Louis is still conflicted about humanity in ways, because it like keeps them young and like it keeps them connected to humanity, and something about that keeps a vampire spirit alive or something. It keeps them engaged, and so Armand is interested in Louis because of that in a way.
Yeah.
And then, you know, as events play out, when he starts to lose his humanity, Armand is less interested in him. So
right, yeah, no, you're right. It was like he was this path to like, because Armand had sort of become really detached from his humanity, and Louis represented a path to that. I was struck by like how, I wonder if it was accidental, and it had to have been accidental, but like she's creating such a rife world for cosplay and culture to rise up around her books with this coven and these theatrics, and it felt it almost felt like, you know, like a bondage party or something that you'd see or read about or whatever, or go to. It was like, it felt like it was so incredibly sexual while not being directly sexual. Everybody's so stylish yet so dangerous, and you know, these like extravagant men with their like, you know, rippling muscles and sort of almost like romance style heroes, right? And then you have all these women, and I don't know, it's just like there's something about it that I was like, did she just accidentally create something that was going to be so engaging for so many people? Because I feel like this became a huge part of like vampire culture, goth culture, people who you know live their lives sort of embodying this style, at least.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that like her mother lived like a bohemian lifestyle, right? So maybe this is her like engaging with that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think she set out to create anything like that people would be imitating necessarily, but I think that that's always the case, right? When something really hits like society in this way and changes culture, I feel like it's almost accidental most of the time.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard people say that like that's why it's important to describe what your characters are wearing. Which is interesting, because I'm someone who, like, when I write, I tend to not really focus on clothing, as I just don't find it very interesting. Yeah. And I always kind of feel like, yeah, you'll supply the clothing in your mind, you know, you don't really have to. But like, there's something to be said for like, hey, if you want people to ever cosplay a character, make sure you describe how they look. Otherwise, they'll, you know, won't have anywhere to go. I don't know. It's fun. Anyway, yeah, Armand. What did you think of Armand as a sort of a character? I don't know if I was like completely on board with their connection when he sort of.
Yeah, agreed. It totally felt nefarious the whole way, like you were saying. It felt.
I kept expecting it to be turned on him.
Yeah, it's gonna be like and like realistically, it is ulterior motives. It is kind of like him selfishly wanting to keep himself young and engaged in culture and society because of.
Yeah, but he's not like lying to him.
Right.
Which is what I thought was happening, right?
Right. Yeah, you almost felt like, well, and then the other thing comes with the following scene where like he allows some stuff to happen, when he could, you know, Armand has.
Let's get into the next part of the plot, so we can talk about that.
I would just say he's also passive in ways that he could have not been, and would have changed outcomes of the story.
Okay, so let's get into this final chunk of plot, and then we can really wrap this up. So convinced that Louis will leave her for Armand, Claudia convinces Louis to turn a Parisian doll maker, Madeleine, into a vampire to serve as a replacement companion. Louis, Madeleine, and Claudia live together for a brief time until all three are abducted by Armand's coven. Lestat arrives, having survived the fire in New Orleans. His accusations against Louis and Claudia result in Louis being locked in a coffin to starve, while Claudia and Madeleine are locked in an open courtyard. Armand arrives and releases Louis from the coffin, but Madeleine and Claudia are burned to death by the rising sun. A devastated Louis finds their ashen remains. Louis returns to the theater the following night, burning it to the ground and killing all the vampires inside, leaving with Armand. Together, the two travel across Europe for several years, but Louis never fully recovers from Claudia's death, and the emotional connection between himself and Armand quickly dissolves. Tired of the old world, Louis returns to New Orleans in the early 20th century. Telling the boy of one last encounter with Lestat in New Orleans in the 1920s, Louis ends his tale. After 200 years, he is weary of immortality and all the pain and suffering to which he has had to bear witness. The boy, however, seeing only the great powers granted to a vampire, begs to be made into a vampire himself. Angry that his interviewer learned nothing from his story, Louis refuses, attacking the boy and vanishing without a trace. The boy then leaves to track down Lestat in hopes that he can give him immortality. Okay, so that's the rest of the novel. Now, anything's fair game. You were touching on what happens with Armand at the theater, so
right.
Go ahead.
So the whole setup is if you kill a vampire, the other vampires will come after you and will
it's like the one crime you can commit
right.
that vampires you can't do.
Since Lestat returns, then the other vampires come after everybody who tried to kill him, basically, and that's when Lestat could have, stepped in a way. I know it's like a rule, but they didn't kill Lestat. They attempted to. So they ended up attacking them, which then led to Claudia and Madeline dying, and that leads to Lestat becoming unhappy because eventually Louis Louis loses everything here and is completely devastated as a totally different character, and Armand eventually leaves. Basically, they're not interested in each other anymore. There's no spark. There's no life there.
After a while, though, they go around together for a while.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And there is a sort of a secret being withheld here because Armand actually was integral in the burning of Claudia and Madeline, and he lies about that. But then by the time he reveals it to Louis kind of already knows or doesn't care.
Yeah, exactly. It's too late to do anything about it. He just doesn't even engage with it. There's a couple of things I want to touch on here. You were talking about the relationship of Anne Rice to Claudia's character, and I couldn't help but when you were just reading that summary, think about Madeline and what she represented to a mother and child sort of vampire duo.
Let me give you one more detail that'll even further that. Anne Rice is known for having an extensive porcelain doll collection.
There you go. Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah.
So
this is a doll maker who, Claudia is repeatedly described as being sort of a immortal doll, right? Like she will never grow out of this body. And Madeline is a doll maker who lost a child,
right? Who
is granted immortality to become this immortal partner of Claudia's, but then is killed immediately. And ends up dying with Claudia.
Right. And you got to think of Anne Rice's sort of writing this into the story with regards to immortality, being with Claudia forever, being with, just like the tragedy of what Anne Rice has gone through, like how much she must wish that she could spend, eternity with that child that she lost and all that. It's just
and I think also seeing the darkness of what would immortality mean, and she lives on in my mind, but she always lives on as a 5-year-old. That's my only memory of her is that age, so I'll never get to see what she would become.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot in there. And I watched a video where Anne Rice was giving sort of writing advice, and one of the bits that I really liked was her talking about how she believes that you should write to pain, find the thing that hurts, and to try and work it out through your writing, but also write to pleasure. She said, find the things that excite you, find the things that are pleasurable, and write to them as well. And I think we see both here in the book. But when I heard her say that, I was thinking of these moments and how that, her decision to do that is one of the things that I think helped make her career what it is.
Yeah. It just that makes a lot of sense. Everybody, as far as I've ever been taught, is just you have something that's special to you that you're passionate about, that you can speak about that no one else can. And although that might not necessarily always be the case, there is something that you do know, whether it's a small thing or a big thing, whether it's an idea for a whole book or whether it's just a section, one little line or something like that. There's something that as your sort of and it's something that like you want to get out. And I feel like you have to sort of lean into that stuff. And as much as it probably hurt Anne Rice to write this, it's probably also a form of therapy. I would, and I'm just assuming, obviously.
Yeah, she was able to come through this period successfully, and you have to. I like to think that writing this book helped her work through these emotions, because, I mean, something like that, it sent her in a downward spiral for years, and I don't know, it's really incredible that she was able to even come out of it at all, much less with the success that she had.
So in the actual story, in terms of things that happened, they burned down Madeline's doll shop, and they talk about the fire purifying. Claudia specifically is talking about like the fire purifying and like how she loves the burning, and Louis doesn't like see the burning as the same thing, and she's sort of like optimistic on it, and he's not.
It's just destruction.
Right, destruction, that's what it was. And then that would go on to sort of inform the next few things that would happen in the novel, with like burning of Claudia and Madeline, the burning down of the theater by Louis. And then, I think like the who ultimately was right in that. Was it a purifying for Claudia because she could never fully live a full life that she wanted to, or was it the destruction of everything for Louis? Those two.
Yeah. So the final paragraph of the last, or not the last part, the second to last part before the sort of denouement of returning to New Orleans, touches on this, and I actually did want to read that. Before we do, real quick, I just wanted to say that the burning down of the theater and Louis beheading Santiago was pretty cool. Like, that was a pretty cool moment of him, just like, he was this, I don't know, fucking spirit of vengeance. It's the first time we see him like actively doing something. I was like, fuck yeah, finally doing something, Louis. He is like, not having any of it. He had just learned that like killing a vampire is the worst thing you can do, and so he's like, well, fuck it, I'm gonna kill all of them.
Right. Yeah. I mean, he lost. That's like like you said, it's vengeance. He lost everything. It's all over for him, and like we see going forward, he also doesn't care if there are humans in the building. He doesn't care about anything, which is showing that like he's lost that humanity that he struggled with the whole story. There's one other thing that I wanted to talk about too, is this sketch artist thing that happens where he ends up killing that artist for the sketch of himself. And how that also shows the loss of humanity. He killed someone for the sketch, and he was so confronted by it. He was staring at it for like a day or something. And then going forward, they go into the Louvre, and he's looking at the art, and he can appreciate it for the effort that it took. He can appreciate it for the art that it is and what it represents, but he can't attach with it because he feels like he doesn't any longer connect with the humanity that created the art. So it's like that moment of him connecting with the sketch in such an intense way, and it's just a quick sketch by an artist, versus the greatest works of art in the world in the Louvre that he connects with because he sees the effort, but he doesn't connect with because he doesn't see the humanity of, like, he's not challenged by it because he doesn't connect with humanity anymore. I felt like that was also something being said with the art.
Yeah, so I think you're definitely touching on something that is integral to understanding sort of some of the final messages of this book, and that ties directly into the bit I was going to read. It's a longer paragraph, but I think it's worth it. So he says, "But something had occurred to me there, or rather, something I had already been aware of merely became clearer. I had gone to the Louvre that night to lay down my soul, to find some transcendent pleasure that would obliterate pain and make me utterly forget even myself. I'd been upheld in this. As I stood on the sidewalk before the doors of the hotel waiting for the carriage that would take me to meet Armand, I saw the people who walked there, the restless boulevard crowd of well-dressed ladies and gentlemen, the hawkers of papers, the carriers of luggage, the drivers of carriages, all these in a new light. Before, all art had held for me the promise of a deeper understanding of the human heart. Now the human heart meant nothing. I did not denigrate it. I simply forgot it. The magnificent paintings of the Louvre were not, for me, intimately connected with the hands that had painted them. They were cut loose and dead like children turned to stone. Like Claudia, severed from her mother, preserved for decades in pearl and hammered gold. Like Madeline's dolls. And of course, like Claudia and Madeline and myself, they could all be reduced to ashes." So yeah, I thought that section really spoke to what you were just talking about, and the connection of art with meaning, and I don't know, just like it's a really somber moment, and I think reflects the mind of the writer at this time, and feeling like, kind of hopeless and disconnected and like almost a nihilist in a way, like nothing matters here. And anything, also just how transient everything is, like how all of it can be reduced to ashes. But there's something there too about like the tragedy of Louis being unable to see the connection, and he had been putting all of the weight on the art itself, but maybe the lesson there is that the important thing was the people who made it. Right. And the tragedy is he can no longer see the connection to those people.
Exactly. Yeah. That is exactly what I was trying to get at, but you said it a lot more eloquently. So I'm glad you read that and said that.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think I got helped by the book there. It's in the text. And that's one of the lessons that I really like. This book, it's surprising in that way, and it ends on these like kind of depressing notes, and not the ways you might expect. I don't know what you expect from a book like this, but. I wasn't necessarily expecting this. What about the boy at the end here and his wanting of to be? He's like, after everything Louis says, he's like, "Ooh, I want that."
Yeah,
you don't understand what that would mean to someone like me, he says to Louis, even though Louis is at the same time going like, "I failed. How can you possibly want to be a vampire?"
So we're again engaging with Louis lost his humanity, right? He's convinced himself he's lost his humanity, but he's doing this interview in the hopes that he convinces people to listen to it and then not want to pursue something like this, or to sort of be active and engaged in their life. Don't be passive, and don't make the same mistakes that he did. But this kid who he's giving the interview to, the boy, immediately turns around and is like, I want that, because there's this like oxymoron of you want it until you have it, and then you don't realize what you had before. And it's this like, you can't understand it until you're an immortal. You can't understand why you being a mortal human is so special. And it's this like endless cycle of like, people will always want this because they can never get the perspective until they don't have it.
Yeah. Well, also, I think the boy would argue, and, maybe I would argue as well, that like, if you're an immortal who, is struggling with the nature of your existence, you may have forgotten the tragedy of the brevity of a mortal life. And, when the boy says, you don't know what that power would mean to someone like me and to us, I think it's true. I think Louis has forgotten what that could mean.
I mean, it can,
so it goes both ways.
Once you become the immortal, everything that's worth living life for, like all you have left is your life. And then unless you have other people to connect to, like Lestat or Claudia, then there is no reason to, you're by yourself in a world, the loneliness that we talked about. We also talked about it in the Old Guard, like being alone in that existence would be, I think, the worst case scenario. And like in a perfect world, you get you and all your loved ones to become immortals, and you just live out that fantasy forever. But like, it just like, for whatever reason, is never going to work out like that,
Well, in fiction, there's always catches, right? And one of the huge ones for vampires is that you become a mass murdering, serial killer, essentially, a monster who also can only experience only the night and not the day. Like, there's so many prices paid for this, which is what makes it interesting, right? Like, and I don't know. I thought it was. I personally had a lot of fun with this novel. I like that style. As I just read it, there's a beauty to that style of writing, that I enjoyed. I can see like getting tired of it, and sometimes just wanting to know what happens. But I don't know. I liked it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Overall, like really, really glad that I've read this story now and have this cultural context and overall, yeah, just like to get that sort of, to put this in place with like vampire stories and monster stories and what it's meant to society and how it's changed storytelling. And because we've seen this sort of tortured immortal so many times now. And like, I don't know, like you said, I don't know if it's the first case of it, but it's a very popular version of it.
She sort of established the archetype of the vampire that all other vampires are sort of compared to, right? Like, I saw an interview with her talking about, the interviewer was asking her about Twilight and and True Blood. And it seemed like he was really hoping to like stir up some drama, between her and these authors. But she's like a fan of them. She's like, yeah, I like both of them. Twilight, they put vampires in high school. She's like, my vampires would have hated it, but they created vampires that were okay with it, and made it appealing to that. And then she said, in True Blood, you take vampires and you put them at the corner bar, and you make them approachable in that way, and you make them like a small town Louisiana. And I can see that, to me, it seemed like she really liked, well, it's like a fan of True Blood. Said that, she was, Charlene Harris, she was reading the books and watching the show. And I also like to see that where it's like, like Stephen King loves horror. You know what I mean? Like people who like embody a genre in some way, you like to see that they still love it.
Right.
Like the passion's still there. They can still be excited by these like variations on the things that they do. Right,
because the opposite is what I hate to see is the competition that people feel like they feel like the heat's on for them, like they're getting, there's some sort of competition, like which one's better and all this other stuff. And
the interviewer was totally trying to get her to like talk some trash about these other authors and be like, mine's the best, and but she wasn't interested in doing that.
Yeah, I like that.
Props to her for that. Very cool. I'm going to be really excited to get into this movie now because I know that when I saw it, I had no idea what I was going to watch, and then I saw it a long time ago, and like now I'm going in having read the book, and it's just going to be a completely different experience, and I'm going to be really interested to see what you think of it.
Yeah, I'm excited.
It's a fun one. So shout out to Jamie D again for commissioning this. It's really cool. Hopefully you're enjoying the coverage. If you wanted to become a patron yourself, go to patreon.com/inktofilm, and you can sign up there. We have all kinds of bonus content. We have like 30 bonus episodes on there that you can find if you sign up. Lots of other tiers with different value.
Yeah, and make sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink2Film. And we have the Council of the Inklings on Facebook, where you can sort of vote in polls. You can engage with. We post all sorts of news, any sort of adaptation stuff that's coming out, things we might cover in the future.
Poppy War was just announced that they're going to be making into a TV show, I think. So
very
lots
cool.
of whenever I see some cutting edge adaptation news, I post it in there. If you like this episode, actually let us know in the form of a rating review on whatever podcast app you use, or if you're on YouTube, make sure to like the video, comment, let us know. We've been getting some steam going on there this year. We really appreciate it. It helps get the word out.
Yeah, and thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, so we will be back next week with the film, but until next time,
thanks for listening.